I'm a psychiatric nurse at Willowbrook Mental Health Institute in Burlington, Vermont, or at least I was, until I requested a transfer to pediatric oncology 8 months ago. You can call me Rebecca Hayes if you want. During my 21 years in adult psychiatric nursing, I've worked with every type of mental illness you can imagine: treatment-resistant schizophrenia, severe dissociative identity disorder, catatonic depression, and every kind of psychological trauma the human mind can endure. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one patient who made me question everything I thought I knew about the difference between psychosis and reality, and ultimately convinced me that some secrets are too dangerous for the human mind to hold. Her name was Vivian Thorne, and not a day goes by that I don't wonder if she was telling the truth all along. Willowbrook Mental Health Institute is one of New England's most comprehensive psychiatric facilities, serving patients from across Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts. It's a sprawling 300-bed complex, nestled in the Green Mountains, with specialized units for acute crisis intervention, long-term stabilization, forensic psychiatry, and what we called the chronic care wing. Ward 12, where I spent most of my career, working with patients whose conditions had proven resistant to conventional treatment. In psychiatric nursing, especially on a chronic care ward, you develop what we call professional immunity to the impossible. You learn to listen with genuine empathy as patients describe elaborate conspiracies, alien abductions, government mind control experiments, and supernatural persecution, all while maintaining the clinical objectivity necessary to provide effective care. After 2 decades of this work, I thought I had heard every possible variation of paranoid delusion, religious psychosis, and dissociative fantasy that the human psyche could generate. My specialty was working with patients diagnosed with severe paranoid disorders, individuals whose minds had constructed alternate realities so compelling and detailed that they could no longer distinguish between their internal experiences and external truth. These are people who live in worlds where every stranger is a potential threat, every coincidence is evidence of conspiracy, and every electronic device might be a tool of surveillance or control. I had worked with patients who believed the CIA had implanted chips in their brains, others who were convinced that their neighbors were poisoning their water supply, and several who insisted that their own family members had been replaced by identical imposters. In every case, no matter how elaborate or internally consistent these belief systems became, they remained what we clinically classify as delusions, fixed false beliefs that persist despite clear evidence to the contrary. What made me particularly effective in this field was my ability to validate patients' emotional experiences while gently challenging their interpretations of reality. I could acknowledge the genuine terror someone felt about being watched, while helping them understand that their fear might be a symptom of illness rather than a response to actual persecution. This balance between empathy and reality testing had served me well throughout my career, until I met Vivian Thorne. The case I'm about to describe began on November 3, 2022, when Vivian was admitted to Willowbrook under an emergency psychiatric hold. She was 31 years old, originally from a rural community called Millfield Hollow, about 60 miles northeast of Burlington, near the Canadian border. Vivian had been discovered by Vermont State Police after her employer reported that she hadn't shown up for work in over 2 weeks. When officers performed a welfare check at her isolated cabin, they found Vivian in what could only be described as a state of absolute terror. She had barricaded herself inside her home using furniture, had covered every window with aluminum foil, and had disconnected or destroyed every electronic device in the house: television, radio, computer, even her landline telephone. The walls were covered with hundreds of pages of handwritten notes, diagrams, and what appeared to be detailed surveillance logs documenting the movements of vehicles and people around her property. Vivian was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and claimed that a research organization had been conducting cognitive harvesting experiments on her for the past 18 months. She insisted that they had developed technology capable of extracting and recording human memories, and that she had been selected as a test subject because of her unusual neural architecture. When the paramedics arrived, Vivian initially refused medical assistance, screaming that the ambulance crew were extraction agents sent to transport her to a memory laboratory where they would complete their experiments. It took 4 officers and 2 paramedics to safely transport her to our emergency department, where she arrived in a state of acute paranoid psychosis. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, our chief psychiatrist, conducted the initial evaluation. Vivian's presentation was classic for paranoid schizophrenia, with technology-focused delusions, an increasingly common variant we'd been seeing more frequently as digital surveillance anxiety became more prevalent in popular culture. Her symptoms included persistent auditory hallucinations, elaborate persecutory beliefs involving advanced neurotechnology, and complete social withdrawal driven by terror of imaginary persecution. The decision was made to admit Vivian to Ward 12 for long-term stabilization and treatment. She was started on a combination of antipsychotic medications and assigned to my caseload because of my experience with treatment-resistant paranoid disorders. During Vivian's first 3 months at Willowbrook, her case progressed in ways that were both typical and deeply concerning. She was initially completely resistant to treatment, refusing all medications, insisting that the hospital staff were part of the organization conducting experiments on her, and spending most of her time writing in notebooks that she guarded obsessively. Vivian's delusions were remarkably sophisticated and internally consistent. She claimed that the Cognitive Research Consortium, NASOS, her name for the organization supposedly targeting her, NASOS, had been monitoring her since 2021, when she had supposedly been identified through neural profiling algorithms as possessing an unusual type of memory formation that made her valuable for their research. According to Vivian, this organization had developed technology that could remotely access human memories through electromagnetic field manipulation. She insisted that they had been conducting extraction sessions on her for months, during which they would somehow download and copy her memories while she slept, or during periods when she felt unusually drowsy during the day. These beliefs represent textbook paranoid psychosis, the combination of persecution fears with pseudo-scientific explanations that attempt to make impossible claims seem plausible. In my experience, patients with technology-focused delusions often incorporate real scientific concepts in distorted ways, creating elaborate theories that sound sophisticated but are fundamentally impossible. What made Vivian's case particularly challenging was her intelligence and educational background. She held a master's degree in library science from the University of Vermont and had worked as a research librarian before her mental health deteriorated. This meant that her delusions were supported by an extensive vocabulary of scientific and technical terms that made her false beliefs sound more credible than they actually were. Vivian could spend hours explaining the supposed neurological mechanisms by which her memories were being harvested, describing electromagnetic frequencies, neural pathway mapping, and memory consolidation processes with enough accuracy to sound convincing to anyone unfamiliar with actual neuroscience. But knowledge of scientific terminology doesn't make impossible claims true, it just makes the delusions more elaborate. During our early sessions, Vivian would describe her life before the supposed surveillance began. She had lived alone in Millfield Hollow for 5 years, working remotely for the Vermont State Library System, cataloging historical documents and managing digital archives. She described herself as naturally introverted and private, someone who preferred the solitude of her mountain cabin to social interaction. According to Vivian, the first signs of being targeted appeared in spring 2021, when she began noticing unfamiliar vehicles on the rural roads near her home. She claimed that these vehicles would appear at regular intervals, always driven by different people, but following patterns that suggested coordinated surveillance. She insisted that the surveillance escalated over several months, with the supposed research team using increasingly sophisticated methods to monitor her activities. Vivian claimed they had placed hidden cameras around her property and installed listening devices in. I'm a psychiatric nurse, at Willowbrook Mental Health Institute in Burlington, Vermont, or at least I was, until I requested a transfer to pediatric oncology 8 months ago. You can call me Rebecca Hayes if you want. During my 21 years in adult psychiatric nursing, I've worked with every type of mental illness you can imagine: treatment-resistant schizophrenia, severe dissociative identity disorder, catatonic depression, and every kind of psychological trauma the human mind can endure. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one patient who made me question everything I thought I knew about the difference between psychosis and reality, and ultimately convinced me that some secrets are too dangerous for the human mind to hold. Her name was Vivian Thorne, and not a day goes by that I don't wonder if she was telling the truth all along. Willowbrook Mental Health Institute is one of New England's most comprehensive psychiatric facilities, serving patients from across Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts. It's a sprawling 300-bed complex nestled in the Green Mountains, with specialized units for acute crisis intervention, long-term stabilization, forensic psychiatry, and what we called the chronic care wing. Ward 12, where I spent most of my career, working with patients whose conditions had proven resistant to conventional treatment. In psychiatric nursing, especially on a chronic care ward, you develop what we call professional immunity to the impossible. You learn to listen with genuine empathy as patients describe elaborate conspiracies, alien abductions, government mind control experiments, and supernatural persecution, all while maintaining the clinical objectivity necessary to provide Vivian claimed that the cognitive harvesting experiments had begun in earnest during the summer of 2021. She described specific incidents when she would lose several hours of time, awakening with no memory of what had occurred, but with physical evidence that someone had been in her cabin. Furniture moved slightly, books rearranged, food missing from her refrigerator. According to Vivian, these memory gaps became more frequent and longer in duration as the supposed experiments continued. She claimed that by autumn 2021, she was losing entire days, awakening with detailed handwritten notes in her own handwriting, describing activities and conversations that she had no memory of experiencing. I documented these accounts as part of Vivian's complex delusional system, noting the way she had incorporated memory loss, a common symptom of various psychiatric conditions, into her persecution beliefs. Patients often create elaborate explanations for symptoms they don't understand, and Vivian's memory extraction theory was a sophisticated attempt to explain experiences that likely resulted from her underlying mental illness. During our session on March 8, 2023, Vivian began describing specific incidents from her supposed surveillance period with a level of detail that was both impressive and concerning. She told me about a particular day in June 2021 when she claimed she had been followed while shopping for groceries in Millfield Hollow's only general store. According to Vivian, 2 individuals had entered the store shortly after she arrived: a woman with prematurely gray hair, wearing a green University of Vermont sweatshirt, and a man with distinctive heterochromia, different colored eyes, who walked with a slight limp and carried a leather messenger bag with a specific pattern of scuff marks on one corner. Vivian claimed that these individuals positioned themselves where they could observe her shopping, and that she overheard them discussing personal information about her that strangers couldn't possibly know: her graduate school thesis topic, her childhood fear of thunderstorms, and specific details about her late mother's battle with Alzheimer's disease. As Vivian described this incident, she mentioned that the woman had purchased a very specific combination of items: strawberry yogurt, whole wheat bread, turkey sandwich meat, green tea, and a particular brand of hand soap that came in a distinctive blue container. She said the man had bought only a newspaper and a candy bar, paying with exact change that he counted out very methodically. I noted these details in Vivian's file as examples of the elaborate false memories that patients with paranoid disorders often create to support their persecution beliefs. The specificity of her descriptions was remarkable, but paranoid patients frequently develop exceptionally detailed delusional memories. However, Vivian then mentioned something that caught my attention. She said that while pretending to examine canned goods, she had overheard the woman mention a local news story about a barn fire that had occurred the previous night on Riverside Road, about 3 miles from Millfield Hollow's town center. Vivian described the fire in considerable detail. A large red dairy barn owned by a family named the Andersons, damage to the hayloft and feed storage areas, the successful rescue of 12 dairy cows, and the fact that the fire had been caused by faulty electrical wiring in the barn's milking equipment. She also mentioned that the woman had commented to her companion about how the Anderson family's youngest daughter had just graduated from high school and had been planning to use the barn for her wedding reception later that summer. Something about the specificity of Vivian's description of this barn fire nagged at me for the rest of that day. During my dinner break, I decided to satisfy my curiosity by searching online for news reports about fires in the Millfield Hollow area during June 2021. What I discovered made me deeply uncomfortable. There had indeed been a barn fire on Riverside Road on the exact date Vivian had mentioned. The local newspaper's website contained a detailed article that confirmed every element of Vivian's description: the red dairy barn owned by the Anderson family, the damage to the hayloft and feed storage areas, the rescue of 12 dairy cows, and the electrical wiring cause. Most unsettling of all, the article mentioned that the Anderson family's daughter Emma had indeed been planning to hold her wedding reception in the barn later that summer, and that the family was now scrambling to find an alternative venue. Initially, I rationalized this coincidence. Vivian was from the Millfield Hollow area, so it was entirely possible that she had read this news story when it occurred and incorporated it into her delusional memories. Patients with paranoid disorders often weave real events into their false belief systems, using genuine details to make their impossible claims seem more credible. But as I continued reviewing my notes from sessions with Vivian, I realized that her accounts contained numerous similar details that could potentially be verified. She had described specific businesses in Millfield Hollow, named particular individuals who supposedly lived in the area, and referenced local events and occurrences with remarkable precision. Professional curiosity, and I'll admit, growing unease, compelled me to begin fact-checking some of these details. Over the following week, I spent my free time researching Vivian's claims, using online resources to verify whether the people, places, and events she described actually existed. The results of my research were deeply disturbing. Vivian's descriptions of Millfield Hollow, its residents, and events that had occurred there during 2021 were consistently accurate. She could describe the layout of local businesses she claimed to have been followed to, correctly name the owners and employees of various establishments, and accurately recount local news stories and community events. More troubling still, Vivian's knowledge seemed to extend beyond information that would have been available through casual observation or news reports. She could describe the interior layouts of buildings she claimed to have been followed into, accurately identify specific products sold by local merchants, and recount conversations she claimed to have overheard that involved private family matters and personal details about area residents. For example, Vivian had described being followed into Millfield Hollow's small post office, where she claimed to have overheard the postmaster, Harold Chen, discussing his concern about his teenage son's poor grades and his wife's recent diagnosis with type 2 diabetes. When I discreetly researched this family online, I discovered social media posts and public records that confirmed Mr. Chen did indeed have a teenage son who had been struggling academically, and that his wife had recently begun posting about diabetes management and dietary changes. Similarly, Vivian had described overhearing a conversation at the town's only gas station between the owner and a customer about the customer's elderly mother's hip replacement surgery and her slow recovery process. Online obituaries and social media activity confirmed that this customer's mother had indeed undergone hip replacement surgery during the time frame Vivian specified, and had experienced complications that prolonged her recovery. I found myself spending hours each evening verifying details from Vivian's accounts, and the pattern that emerged was both consistent and inexplicable. Her memory for factual information about people, places, and events in Millfield Hollow during the period when she claimed to have been under surveillance was remarkably accurate. Far more accurate than should have been possible for someone experiencing the severe paranoid psychosis that had brought her to our attention. But accuracy regarding peripheral details doesn't validate the core delusions. I reminded myself that Vivian could have conducted extensive research on her community, perhaps as part of her work as a research librarian, or she might simply have had exceptional observational skills and memory recall that allowed her to retain an unusual amount of information about her environment. To better understand how Vivian might have acquired such detailed information about her community, I requested copies of her employment records from the Vermont State Library System. What I learned provided some potential explanation for her remarkable accuracy about local details, but also raised new questions that I found increasingly troubling. Vivian had indeed worked as a research librarian specializing in historical archives and local genealogy. Her job involved maintaining detailed records about Vermont families, communities, and historical events. She had access to newspaper archives, property records, genealogical databases, and other resources that could have provided her with extensive information about Millfield Hollow and its residents. However, according to her employment supervisor, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, Vivian had been working exclusively on 19th century historical projects during 2021. Her assignment involved cataloging Civil War-era documents and creating digital archives of historical correspondence. She would not have had professional access to current information about contemporary residents of Millfield Hollow through her work. Dr. Warren also mentioned something that struck me as significant. She said that Vivian had been an exceptionally dedicated employee who rarely took time off and typically worked independently with minimal supervision. However, during the summer and fall of 2021, Vivian had begun taking frequent sick days and had seemed increasingly distracted and anxious when she was at work. According to Dr. Warren, Vivian had mentioned being concerned about privacy issues and had asked several times about the library's policies regarding patron information and computer usage logs. She had also begun staying late after hours, ostensibly to work on projects, but Dr. Warren suspected she might have been using the library's resources for personal research. This information suggested a possible explanation for Vivian's detailed knowledge about her community. As a research librarian with after-hours access to comprehensive databases, she could have spent considerable time investigating her neighbors and local events, perhaps as her paranoid symptoms were developing and she became increasingly suspicious of the people around her. But this rational explanation didn't account for some of the more specific and private information Vivian claimed to have overheard, particularly conversations involving personal medical information and family problems that wouldn't have been documented in public records or databases. As spring progressed, Vivian became increasingly comfortable discussing her experiences during our individual sessions. Her medication had stabilized her mood and reduced the intensity of her paranoid episodes, but she remained absolutely convinced that her memories of surveillance and cognitive harvesting were accurate. What concerned me most was that Vivian never exhibited the kind of defensive uncertainty that patients typically show when discussing delusions. Most paranoid patients, even when they're completely convinced of their beliefs, will occasionally express doubt or seek reassurance about their perceptions. They might ask questions like, "Do you think I'm imagining this?" or "I know this sounds crazy." But Vivian never expressed this kind of doubt. She discussed her supposed persecution with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone recounting genuine experiences. When I would gently suggest alternative explanations for her memories, she would listen politely but remain unmoved, as if I was simply misinformed about events she had directly experienced. During our session on April 12, 2023, Vivian began describing what she called the escalation phase of her supposed persecution. She claimed that beginning in September 2021, the memory extraction procedures had become more frequent and intensive, occurring several times per week rather than occasionally. According to Vivian, she would experience what she described as cognitive blanks, periods ranging from several hours to entire days when she would have no memory of her activities or experiences. She would regain awareness to find evidence that she had been active during these periods: meals prepared and eaten, clothing changed, books read and annotated, but with no recollection of performing these activities. Vivian claimed that during these blank periods, she was somehow compelled to document her experiences in detailed written reports. She would awaken to find pages of notes in her own handwriting, describing conversations with neighbors, observations about community activities, and detailed accounts of her daily routines and thoughts. According to Vivian, these involuntary reports became increasingly comprehensive and invasive over time. The supposed researchers weren't just extracting her memories, she claimed. They were forcing her to actively gather intelligence about her community and document private information about the people around her. What made Vivian's claims about involuntary documentation particularly disturbing was that she had managed to preserve some of these handwritten reports. During her admission to Willowbrook, she had smuggled several notebooks past our security screening by hiding them inside her pillowcase. When these notebooks were discovered during a routine room inspection, they were confiscated and placed in her personal property file. As Vivian's primary nurse, I had access to her personal belongings, and my growing unease about her case compelled me to examine these notebooks more closely. What I found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The notebooks contained hundreds of pages of meticulously detailed observations about life in Millfield Hollow during 2021. The writing was unquestionably in Vivian's hand. I had seen enough samples of her writing during our sessions to be certain of this. However, the content and style of these entries varied dramatically in ways that seemed inconsistent with a single author. Some entries were written in Vivian's normal style, introspective, thoughtful, with the vocabulary and sentence structure I had come to associate with her personality. These entries described her growing anxiety about being watched and her increasing isolation from her community. But interspersed with these personal reflections were sections written in a completely different style, clinical, objective, almost like surveillance reports. These entries documented the daily activities of Millfield Hollow residents with the systematic thoroughness of professional intelligence gathering. For example, one entry described the morning routine of the Chen family at the post office in remarkable detail. Harold Chen arrives at 7:15 a.m., unlocks front door, disables alarm system, code appears to be 4-digit sequence beginning with 1, turns on lights in customer area first, then employee workspace, sorts overnight mail delivery for approximately 45 minutes. Wife Sarah arrives at 8 a.m. with coffee and breakfast pastry, usually from Morrison's Bakery. They discuss son David's academic progress, currently failing algebra and English literature. Sarah mentions doctor's appointment Tuesday for diabetes management consultation. These clinical observations were written in Vivian's handwriting, but the voice and perspective seemed entirely different from her normal personality. It was as if someone else had been controlling her hand while she wrote these detailed intelligence reports about her neighbors' private lives. As I continued examining Vivian's notebooks, I found entries that documented information that seemed impossible for her to have obtained through normal observation. The reports included details about private conversations that had supposedly taken place inside people's homes, accurate descriptions of the interior layouts of buildings she had never entered, and personal information about residents' financial situations, health problems, and family relationships. Most troubling of all, some entries were dated from periods when Vivian claimed to have been experiencing cognitive blanks, times when she insisted she had no memory of her activities. According to her own account, she couldn't possibly remember gathering this information, yet it was documented in her own handwriting with remarkable accuracy and detail. I began spot-checking some of these impossible details, using the same research methods I had employed to verify her earlier claims. Once again, the information proved to be consistently accurate. Vivian's notebooks contained correct details about her neighbors' private lives that she shouldn't have been able to know, information that wasn't available through public records, social media, or casual observation. For instance, one entry described a conversation between the Morrison family, who owned a local bakery, about their financial difficulties and their consideration of selling their business. These conversations had allegedly taken place inside their private residence, not in a public location where Vivian could have overheard it. Yet when I researched the Morrison bakery online, I discovered that they had indeed put their business up for sale during the exact time frame specified in Vivian's notes. Another entry detailed the medical treatment that elderly Mrs. Patterson was receiving for early-stage dementia, including specific medications and dosages. This information would have been protected by medical privacy laws and wouldn't have been accessible through any public source. However, obituary records showed that Mrs. Patterson had died 6 months later from complications related to Alzheimer's disease, confirming that she had indeed been dealing with dementia during the period covered by Vivian's documentation. By late April 2023, I found myself in a professional crisis unlike anything I had experienced during my 2 decades of psychiatric nursing. Everything about Vivian's case contradicted my training, experience, and understanding of how mental illness works. Patients with paranoid delusions don't typically have access to accurate, detailed information about their supposed persecution. Their false beliefs are supposed to be just that, false. The elaborate conspiracy theories and surveillance fantasies that paranoid patients develop are meant to be products of disordered thinking, not accurate descriptions of real events. But Vivian's accounts were proving to be remarkably accurate in ways that seemed to defy explanation. Her descriptions of being watched and followed were supported by correct information about people, places, and events that she shouldn't have been able to know. Her claims about memory loss were documented by handwritten reports that she insisted she had no memory of creating, yet which contained information that could be independently verified. I began consulting with colleagues about Vivian's case, carefully describing her symptoms and treatment response without revealing the details that were troubling me most. Dr. Whitfield agreed that her presentation was unusual, noting that she showed better cognitive organization than most patients with severe paranoid disorders, but he attributed this to her educational background and intelligence. When I mentioned Vivian's exceptionally detailed and consistent delusional memories, Dr. Whitfield suggested that her background as a research librarian might have given her unusual skills in gathering and organizing information, which she was now applying to support her false beliefs about persecution. But I couldn't bring myself to share the most disturbing aspect of Vivian's case: the fact that her supposedly delusional claims were proving to be accurate when subjected to independent verification. How could I explain to my colleagues that I had been fact-checking a patient's paranoid fantasies and finding them to be substantially true? During our session on May 2nd, 2023, I decided to confront the contradiction that was consuming my thoughts. I needed to understand how Vivian could have such accurate information about events she claimed to have experienced during periods of supposed memory loss. Vivian, I said, choosing my words carefully, you've described many incidents from the time when you believe you were being monitored. Your recall for specific details is quite remarkable, but you've also told me that you were experiencing frequent memory gaps during this same period. How do you explain the contradiction between having such detailed memories while also claiming to have lost significant amounts of time? Vivian looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, not the guarded wariness she usually showed when discussing her supposed persecution, but something that looked almost like relief mixed with profound sadness. Rebecca, she said quietly. That's exactly what made me realize something was terribly wrong. I was losing my memories, but somehow gaining information I shouldn't have had access to. It was like someone was trading my real experiences for knowledge about other people's private lives. She leaned forward in her chair, and her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. The memory extraction wasn't just taking things away from me, it was putting new information in items, things I had never learned, conversations I had never heard, details about people I barely knew. That's when I understood that what they were doing to me was far more complex than simple surveillance. Vivian's eyes became very focused, and for the first time since her admission, she looked completely lucid and grounded in present reality, rather than lost in her paranoid fears. They weren't just studying my memories, Rebecca. They were using my mind as a storage system for information they were gathering about the entire community. Every time they extracted my personal experiences, they replaced them with surveillance data about my neighbors. I became a living database of private information about people in Millfield Hollow. She paused, looking directly at me with an intensity that was both compelling and deeply unsettling. The handwritten reports you found in my notebooks. I have no memory of writing them because I wasn't conscious when they were created. Something else was controlling my hand, using my motor functions to document information that had been implanted in my mind during the extraction procedures. Vivian's voice became urgent, almost pleading. The worst part is, I don't think the experiments ended when I was hospitalized. The memory gaps are still happening, Rebecca. Sometimes I lose hours here at Willowbrook, and I wake up knowing things about the other patients and staff members that I shouldn't know. Things I've never been told, conversations I've never overheard. She leaned even closer, and what she said next sent a chill through me that I can still feel today. I think they followed me here. I think they're still using me to gather intelligence, this time about mental health patients and treatment procedures. And Rebecca, I think you might be able to help me prove it, because some of the information I'm gaining now is about you. That night, I found Vivian writing unconsciously at 2 a.m., transcribing a conversation happening 3 floors below in real time. When I touched her shoulder, she gasped awake with no memory of writing. The conversation she documented was actually taking place. I verified it myself. Over the following weeks, Vivian's memory gaps increased. She'd lose days, awakening with detailed intelligence reports about staff and patients written in her handwriting. Her original personality was fading, replaced by something clinical and cold. On August 18, 2023, Vivian disappeared from Willowbrook. No signs of struggle. Cameras mysteriously malfunctioned. I resigned 3 weeks later, transferring to pediatric oncology. Months later, I received a notebook in Vivian's handwriting. Subject integration complete. Original personality successfully replaced. At the bottom, in desperate scroll, Rebecca, they took everything. Don't let them take anyone else. I share this story as a warning. In our age of advancing neurotechnology, the boundaries between impossible and reality are shifting. Vivian's case may represent illegal applications of legitimate brain research, remote memory access, consciousness manipulation. Healthcare workers must watch for patients whose delusions contain impossible accuracy. Don't dismiss technological persecution claims as pure fantasy. The most effective way to hide an impossible crime is targeting those whose impossible experiences will be dismissed as mental illness. Vivian Thorne was intelligent and caring. Her mind was stolen, her identity erased. She deserves to be remembered as more than a psychiatric file. She was proof that consciousness itself may be vulnerable to technological manipulation. I still think about her every day, wondering if the woman I tried to help ever really existed, or if she was already a construction designed to test human credulity. The most terrifying aspect isn't what was done to her, but how easily it was accomplished and completely hidden. In a world where our memories and perceptions may no longer be trustworthy, we must question not just what we know, but how we know it. Some secrets are too dangerous for the human mind to hold, and some patients may be suffering in ways we lack the framework to recognize. The case that made me leave psychiatric nursing forever taught me that the boundary between possible and impossible is far more fluid than I ever imagined. And sometimes the most vulnerable people in our society are being exploited in ways that sound too impossible to believe, which is exactly what makes the exploitation so effective.